IUU fishing in Caribbean and Central America. And then after a quick break, we'll do the second panel on South America. For those of you who are following us on Facebook Live, first of all, welcome, and thank you for attending. And also, you can use the chat function on Facebook Live to submit comments or questions, and we will have space on each of the panels to have questions and answers from members of the audience and the panelists, and not just the panelists necessarily who were at the table, but the panelists throughout the afternoon. So with that, again, let me thank you all and turn it over to Maria Fernanda, who will share some vignettes from the research that we've been carrying out over this past year or so.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, so let me introduce myself. I'm Maria Fernanda Ramirez. I'm from Bogota, Colombia, and I have been investigating environmental crimes for more than 5 years at Inside Crime, which conducts investigations into organized crime in the Americas. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased that you are joining us today at American University for this panel on IUU fishing, coordinated by the Center of Latin American and Latino Studies and the Center of Environment, Community, and Equity. So, as you know, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, what we call IUU fishing, is laying waste to fish stocks, is threatening endangered marine life and ecosystems, and it's also putting in danger the livelihoods of fishers in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is something that we will hear a lot more from our panelists today. Over the course of the past year, Inside Crime and Clouds have been investigating the threat of IUU fishing and also the adverse impacts in the region. And yeah, basically, we did a lot of on-the-ground reporting with different journalists on the 9 countries of study. This includes a lot of interviews with academics, experts, stakeholders, and government authorities, and also the fishers themselves. And much of this reporting can be found, one, in the paper that my colleague Matthew is going to brief you in a minute, and also in our Plunder Oceans investigation that is made up of 9 country reports. So let me give you some examples of what we've learned. So in Panama, what we see is Panama's flag, is also known as a flag of convenience, that flies in transshipment boats that support the Chinese fleet, and this allows boats to stay on to sea for longer periods, for months, and also it makes easy for mix legal and illegal catch, and therefore laundering illegal catch. In Costa Rica's Cocos Island Marine Reserve, we saw how a radar strategy looked like it was going to curb illegal fishing in this biodiverse rich region, but at the end it barely got off the ground. We showed also how Jamaica's waters are being poached by foreign vessels carrying dozens of divers. In Guyana, we also look at how the law enforcement extend to just a fraction of the country's waters. And in Suriname, we learned that there is a vast black market in fishing licenses, especially in the border with Guyana. In South America, we found that Ecuador prohibits shark fishing, but its bycatch laws are fueling the sharking trade. Christina, of course, is going to tell us a lot more about that. In Chile, we look at how fishers are, how do you say that, are overfishing merluza común, that is a common type of hake, and are being blamed for that. But in reality, it's the middlemen who are profiting from this market. In Uruguay, we saw that the port of Montevideo was the last port of call for more than 50 dead fishing crew members. And in Argentina, as you know, the sea shelf is being invaded by dark fleets, especially Chinese dark fleets, that turn off their transponders. Milko also is going to tell us more about that. So we hope you, if you haven't already, if you read our investigation, and once again, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. I look forward to today's conversation, and I give the floor to my colleague Matthew. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I'll try and be quick because we want to go to the experts who are here, and just want to say a few thank yous. First to Maria Fernanda. It's been a pleasure working with Maria Fernanda in Insight Crime on this, as been all of our partnerships. Thank the staff at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, Eric and everyone else, obviously. We can't do this without their support. And most of all, to our audience, both those of you who are here and the much larger audience that's online, but particularly to the experts who are here, because you all helped to fuel the report, and I know that we'll learn a lot from what you have to say today. Before I turn to the panelists, though, I just wanted to say a little bit in terms of academic framework for today's conversation, because I think it's useful for us to think about this not just as a conversation about the policy problem, but also how academic work can support that effort. And this is, of course, we produced as a part of this project a report that is on the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies website. That's a report that looks in particular at the causes and consequences of IUU fishing in 9 countries, as well as the responses, or in some cases the weakness of the responses to those issues. So the 9 countries that we were most focused on were in alphabetical order: Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Guyana, Jamaica, Panama, Suriname, and Uruguay. And you can see there that we kind of made our way around the hemisphere. We leapfrogged a few countries that are of importance, but you know, one way to look at this is that the challenges that these countries face are completely independent of each other. They're very, very different. But on the other hand, they're all tied together by the nature of the problem because of the international nature of fisheries. And Maria Fernanda just offered some of the vignettes that Insight Crime reported on from around the region. But I wanted to lay out what ties them all together. And if we think about the adverse consequences of IUU fishing that we'll be discussing today, there are at least 5 major threads that run through all of them. First is the environmental cost, simply the collapse of fisheries, the collapse of species that might be driven to the boundary of extinction. We've heard from the specialists who are here today and others about the extent to which IUU fishing harms any effort to rationally implement fisheries management. It really makes it all much harder. Secondly, there are direct economic consequences. These include the economic losses from IUU fishing, declining fishing revenue, the loss of livelihood, food security issues, tax revenue losses. Estimates by other scholars suggest as much as 15% of the catch in these 9 countries may be lost to IUU fishing. Third, there are indirect economic costs. We need to remember a point that was made to us in an off-the-record workshop earlier this year by a Caribbean colleague. And he made the point that the collapse of fisheries has impacts that go way beyond fishers themselves, that go beyond the fishing industry. So, for example, in the Caribbean, the decline in fish stocks may drive away sports fishermen, it may drive away scuba divers, it may drive away tourists in general. And then we also see the impact on ancillary industries, such as ship provisioning or fish processing, whatever the case, whatever other associated industries there may be. Fourth, there's a potential conflict that arises because of IUU fishing. I remember I was in the northeastern state of Piauí in the 1990s, so this was many decades ago. Feels like it. And I was talking to a shrimp fisherman on the coast who was telling me about the guerrilla tactics that he and his friends used to try to drive foreign trawlers offshore. And they would take used tractor tires, used car tires, and fill them with concrete and dump them. And the basic idea there, I don't know if it worked or not, but that this would force the trawlers to scoop up huge amounts of concrete and hopefully break their rigging. I don't know if that worked again, but this is a form of conflict at some level. In the Caribbean, we've heard from experts about conflict between Jamaican, Dominican, Honduran fishers. We've heard about conflict between Guyanese and Suriname fishers. We've heard about homicides in Guyana. In Argentina, Milko has shared with us stories about the confrontations between the Argentine authorities and foreign fishing fleets. So you can see here individual conflict, national conflicts, international conflicts, all derived around this issue. Fifth, there are a number of crimes that are associated directly and indirectly with IUU fishing. The directly associated crimes obviously include things like environmental abuse, document fraud, corruption, food fraud. But then there are a variety of crimes that are indirectly associated with IUU fishing. They're not required by the process of IUU fishing, but they often go hand in hand with the IUU fishing. And Philippe Lebion, who's here with us, has written extensively on this, so I'm not going to take his thunder away. But I think it's useful to point out that these indirect crimes often go hand in hand with the kind of direct crimes that IUU fishers engage in. And these might include forced labor, the trafficking of drugs, the trafficking of people, the trafficking of weapons. So today we're going to be talking about all of these phenomena from a range and a variety of different geographical perspectives. There are at least three major dynamics of IUU fishing that are present across the hemisphere. And I know that we're going to hear about them from a variety of different angles, but I'll just quickly run through those and then I'll turn the floor over to Maria Fernanda. So if we think about the dynamics, the way in which this plays out, there is the first level, which is littoral, like coastal, not like the literature, but littoral fishing by marginalized, often marginalized populations. And here, the fishing abuses that we're discussing are often unreported or unregulated catch. I know we'll hear about this from Dr. Jimenez. But for example, the capture of protected species or of juveniles outside of season. This may be small-scale fishing by these marginalized populations, but it's collectively nonetheless quite damaging, not least because it's a dynamic that complicates fisheries management, as I've already mentioned. Secondly, the second dynamic we see is of industrial fishing within countries' EEZs, their exclusive economic zones. Oftentimes, the crimes here may be closer to what Maria Fernanda mentioned when she talked about merluza laundering by middlemen in Chile. We may see elements of catch misreporting, the capture of protected species, mislabeling, and other forms of food and document fraud. And then the third dynamic that I think we'll hear a lot about, particularly from Josh Goodman, who has done incredible reporting on this, is offshore. And here we're often talking about international distant water fleets that are operating in international waters and at the border of EEZs. These fleets are, I think it's fair to say, only very loosely regulated by their flag or port states. As many as 15% of these distant water fleets, perhaps, according to some estimates, are flying flags of convenience. Many of them receive government subsidies of one form or another, and these subsidies, it is estimated by other scholars, mean that they can fish in places that would be unprofitable otherwise. And about half, a little more than half, of fishing grounds are estimated to be unprofitable without these subsidies. So they also engage in transshipment practices that allow them to stay offshore for long periods, and this enables them to outfish local competitors, especially local artisanal competitors. And so This is a particularly damaging, but of course only one of the three dynamics that we'll be discussing. So without further ado, thank you all again. I'll turn the floor over to Maria Fernanda and vacate the table for our first panel. Okay.
Okay, welcome to the first panel on IUU fishing. The Caribbean and Central America would be the focus of this talk. So let me introduce our three panelists. I'll start with Philippe Levillon. He's a professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. Peter Murray currently serves as an advisor to the Fisheries Management and Development Program at the Secretariat of the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism. And Jorge Arturo Jimenez is the Director General at the Mar Viva Foundation, an ocean conservation organization.
Mafe, I'm just going to interrupt, and I'm sorry, but we've been asked by the Facebook Live audience to talk as closely to our microphones as possible because of the
that's
audio.
better now.
Okay,
Perfect. So each of our panelists will be speaking for about 20 minutes. I'll let you know if you're getting closer to the time. And we'll then turn to the question segment. You can raise your hand if you're in the room, or you can write down your questions in the chat in Facebook if you're joining us online. So please, let's start with Philippe.
Okay, thank you so much, Maria Fernanda. I'll be handling the slide, thanks to your help. Yeah, the microphone is close, all good. All right, so this is a paper that basically I wrote with my colleagues Dia Belhabib and David Rockwell. The idea generally about it was to do several things. One was to understand a little bit what's going on with regard to narco-trafficking and fishing, and because there is a lot out there, but very often it's the maritime sector in general, and I talk a little bit about that later. The second aspect was we were a little bit concerned about kind of a hard approach on illegal fishing targeting small-scale fishers. And what we saw is that we had the impression that there's a lot more people going to this already because they're losing their livelihoods from fishing, and they're moving to these other types of livelihoods, and then they're going to be hammered again. And so what we wanted to do is look a little bit also at the war on drug, its record and its impact, etc. And so I'll move to the next slide. So we all know that some crimes have major consequences, and in particular, sorry for the mismatch here, there's a lot out there, but essentially there's many ways people can be hurt as a result of drug trafficking. One of which is obviously that there is competition between gangs. Another one is there is a very heavy repression. Lots of people end up in jail, etc. And third one is we've got many victims among the consumers of drugs as well. Plus there are many, many indirect costs, etc. So I will not go into details, but it's obviously an important aspect of our motivation here. I'll take the next slide. So there's been quite a lot of documentations, but mostly by the agencies that are in charge of doing that kind of work. And although there is some communications, so we can see here on the right, the three major ways, the Pacific and the Eastern and Western Caribbean ways. There's not a lot of academic writing on it, so we thought, okay, we should look into it. Second thing that we observed is the narrative around this in the media has been very driven by kind of anti-piracy, a little bit the same thing that we saw, and you will remember the debates around piracy out of the coast of Somalia, and all the debates around, well, IUU fishing and large-scale legal fishing by European fleets and others may have had an impact there. So there's a lot of debates. So we can move to the next slide if you want. Okay. So what is happening on the ground? I'm not an investigative reporter. Joshua is one of them. And some people have done great work in documenting the massive cost that these things have on those local communities. There's been some excellent reporting and some NGOs that have mobilized in particular to try to address the problem because hundreds of Ecuadorian people have ended up in jail. I went myself to Manta and Jamarillo and those places, and of course it's the irony of seeing the former US base in charge of preventing narco trafficking being put down, closed, and then one of the highest place for trafficking is just a few kilometers away. But when you talk to people there, it's evident that they have espoused this type of livelihood, and some people who are a little bit more risk-prone and entrepreneurial, they want to, as they say in Spanish, salir adelante. They want to distinguish themselves, and the narco culture has really penetrated the imaginary of many of these places, and I would say even Ecuador in general, unfortunately. And so as a result, we see a lot of people who are willing to take the risk of going and venturing at sea for up to 7 days for $5,000 to $10,000. And it's not unique. I know people in Canada who have done the same, smuggling marijuana across the border. So we are in a situation where those communities are ready to make that move and pay the consequences also. And at the same time, many people are very afraid. So I can give you very quickly a small example of a small-scale fisherman working on a 4-meter boat, going just beyond the limit of the coast. And essentially he's saying, yeah, I don't want to get into that. My cousin got arrested. I don't want to get into it. I'm afraid. And instead, I'm just making $10, $15. And I verify we went together and his usual day, etc. So it's a complex picture. It's one that is not simply a question of enforcement. And we talk to people from local NGOs that were trying to address livelihood, education, taking care of the widows, taking care of many of the children from the first sets, because those people, when they're arrested, they're off, for 10, 15 years at a time. They're not going to see their kids. They're not going to have fathers, and we know what can happen when you're missing a father figure in this kinds of setting. Anyway, you can move to the next slide a little bit. Okay, so now after the little anecdotes, what did we try to do with this paper? We tried to have a kind of classic approach, looking at essentially public reports that were available, documenting them, entering them into a database. So we got essentially a period of 2010 to 2017, 296 cases of interdiction. So of course, if we had classified information, this would be a totally different study that would be much more accurate, but this is not our case. And our method was essentially data parsing around time, location, drug type, vessel type, and other offenses, so kind of as much of a disaggregation as we can take. Then we used an estimation technique, essentially with coefficients of variance, in order to get a little bit of an idea of the estimate. Next slide. We used an interdiction rate of 20%. So for those of you who know the literature, it's sometimes 6%, 10%, 15%. We used a quite high one, and we corrected by Navy strength, meaning that every single EZ was associated with a particular naval capacity, whether domestic or associated with the presence of US Coast Guards and Navy assets. So there's a lot of caveats and limitations. I don't want to read them, and I'm conscious of time also, but essentially, this is a very low confidence study. We're not pretending we've got like precise figures, but we do have figures, and as some people say, show me yours, I'll show you mine. And so this is what we come up with, essentially. A few things, you can go to the next slide, is essentially that we've got, like findings that tell us a bit of a story. The story is that we see more and more interdiction, so supposedly more and more fishing vessels and people involved in fishing getting involved into this. Okay, but again, we don't want the narrative that all fishermen are potential drug smugglers. Okay, because that's not where we want to go to. What we observed is that essentially this is significant in terms of smuggling, and that it's diverse and it's affecting a lot of region, and that we see a lot more, smaller vessels, if you want. Okay, so we can go to the next slide a little bit. So again, you can refer to the paper. So for each of those years, we've got the type of drugs, the locations, the approximate locations where they've been arrested, and the size of boats, etc. around here. If we take this, we could think that if indeed our research is correct, more and more small-scale fishermen are either willing or forced into this. And for us, that's the bad news. And it could be linked to several things. One could be IUU, and could be, like smaller catch, meaning that they've got more incentives to go into that trade. Another one could be other forms of loss of access. If you look at, for example, the agenda, the 80 targets, we've got very strong targets for marine protected area. Well, that also has an impact on local fishers because they become more and more enforced. And as you all know from the Caribbean region of Colombia. Next slide, please. So we see the next one after. Okay. So the impacts on the fishers are very diverse, depending on who is being affected. Some are making large sums of money that they reinvest, sometimes to build a house, etc., getting married. They can buy some more equipment, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But what they're facing very often also is coercion into drug trafficking through debt and threats, hijacking of theft, boat, outboard theft and fuel, etc. So one thing that we remarked is with the rising criminality, at least for Ecuador, really it becomes very difficult for fishers to operate. As one of them said to me, we're stuck between the authorities, the ecologists, and the narcos. And between these three, it becomes very hard to operate a decent livelihood. They jailed in other countries, there are injuries and death at sea, and they can be murdered for collecting discarded parcels, etc. The next slide, please. Okay, so what are the impacts on IUU? And that's where we're really starting. Yeah, this is one of the most well-known cases. This is something that essentially is more an agenda for research. This is where the investigative reporting, the people from Inside Crime, etc., have done great work, could do maybe more, etc. So first, we could think that narco-trafficking is having an increase in IUU, okay? Simple thing, people go out at sea, they're trafficking, and they're doing illegal fishing. The only time, we didn't see much evidence of illegal fishing in parallel to narco-trafficking, at least not reported. There was very few instances that we were surprised. Some of them were essentially on the return trips, especially for large boats that are not sunk at destination. The fibras will be sunk, but the larger boats may not be sunk. So if they're not sunk, then they've got time to come back, and yeah, they may be fishing in places where they're not supposed to, etc. The second that is, in my sense, much more worrying is the reinvestment, because suddenly you have a lot of money that are become available. People can upgrade the equipment, get larger boats, they can move into semi-industrial or industrial, and that's going to increase the capacity, etc. And maybe not completely illegal, maybe not IUU, but nonetheless, it will have an impact on the ecosystems and the stocks. They can be also decrease in IUU, okay, through, for example, a reduction in fishing activities. So loss of equipment and insecurity at sea, as I mentioned. A lot of fishers are now apprehensive, for example, of going out at night, things that they were doing. And we know that for some fishing arts, fishing techniques, we need to go out at night, otherwise. So some species get, in effect, protected because of that. Of course, drug trafficking can provide alternative income sources and diversify the portfolio. They can set up small businesses out of the money that they get, etc. And so that actually gets them out of it. And they can be also increased monitoring, control, and surveillance. And so that also would deter IUU. However, my sense from what we read and the people we've talked to, including the Coast Guards and Ecuador, etc., it's quite clear that the focus is on drug trafficking and not IUU. It's very rare that they make as much effort. So I think we can move one more slide. So the discussion, as I mentioned, is there is little reported overlap between drug trafficking and illegal fishing at the time of interdiction, at least. There is rising involvement of small fisher boats. Artisanal fishers are vulnerable and become seniors, etc. And the drug revenue laundering within the fishing sector could lead to fishing overcapacity and potentially greater conflicts. And the last one, or about, yeah. So there are further research there, as I outlined. Both, I would say, on the what is happening and also the potential solutions. And there, I think linking with local NGOs that work with those fishing communities, try to get them out of narco trafficking and out of illegal fishing is very important. So again, it's a lot of long-term, grounded, work with these communities. So I think we can look if there is one more, but I think that's it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
very much, Philippe, for this presentation. Thank you for not taking more than 20 minutes as well. So yeah, thanks for sharing with us your main findings of your investigation and your colleagues' investigation. It's very interesting to see how the fisheries sector constitutes a growing channel for drug trafficking. It's quite concerning as well to see this cycle, right? Like the overfishing, the smaller catch, all this is leading to fishers to pursue other opportunities, and sometimes these opportunities are other crimes, as Philippe showed us during his presentation, and this concerning connection between drug trafficking and fishing, and illegal fishing. Thanks very much, Philippe. We can turn now to Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may, I'd rather do this standing up from here. I tend to be more comfortable that way than sitting down there and everything is behind me and I'm not seeing anything because of the light in my eyes and so on. Makes me feel very uncomfortable. I feel much more comfortable doing this way. And I'm hoping that the lights won't affect me from seeing my slides. I'll try and go through fairly quickly because I got a lot of slides. I had time with that 17 minutes, so I'm hoping that I can stick to that. Depends on how nervous you make me feel talking to an organization like me. I tend to stumble when I'm that way, but let's see if we can get it going. I'm Peter Murray. I work for the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism. Prior to that, I worked for the Organization of Eastern Caribbean State Secretariat, and prior to that, I worked at the Department of Fisheries of St. Lucia. I find myself looking back and realizing that I started working in fisheries on the 16th of April, 1981. Can't get over this thing as yet. Working at the national level, sub-regional level, and regional levels has been a challenge, and I'm hoping that by showing you my presentation, you get a feel for a number of things. IUU fishing is a problem. We know that. There's a tendency to think that no one is doing anything about it, that the region is not doing anything about it, but there are limitations. What I'm hoping in my presentation is that you'll get a feel for some of what we've been trying to do in the region, notwithstanding the challenges that we have. So if I can get this thing to go, the importance in the region. 70% of the population in the region lives along the coast, and therefore we have some dependence on income and food from fisheries in a lot of our communities. In addition to that, you have to see the importance as animal protein for our countries. In terms of the fisheries sector, one of the challenges is that it's multi-species and multi-gear. It includes small-scale and industrial operations. So you're going across the spectrum, as it were. The number of marine fishers are estimated a couple of years ago at about 113,000. But however, using an FAO estimate of 3 to 1, we've come to the fact that there's probably about 354,000 persons employed in the sector in general. That just gives you an idea of general landings, marine landings. It's been a decline. You'll see the decline for a number of reasons. Some may jump to IUU fishing. However, we have a number of other factors, climate change impacts and other factors, which we tend to forget when we want to bash everybody. I'm not going to tell you about all the ills of IUU fishing. It's been spoken of already. And I'm not going to go into detail on that either, because I'm preaching to the converted. So you know it all already. Yeah? Move the way it's supposed to move. Right, there we go. IUU fishing in the Caribbean. It's been estimated, but put it this way. A significant amount of the IUU fishing in the region, especially among the CRFM member states, is by local vessels in national waters. But we think it's more the two U's. It's more a matter of what's not reported and what's not regulated, not so much a question of illegal. There are significant amounts of other forms of IUU fishing, but we don't know exactly what they are. We don't have the capacities. Recently, the FAO has been talking about methodologies for estimating IUU fishing, and we're hoping that we can get a picture, a feel from some of that. But this is based on a study done in 2013, I must admit here. The severity, therefore, at this point in time is not really known. 80% of our governments were of the view that it's an important thing that needs to be dealt with. The incursions are thought to be regular, and the impact on resources and to a significant extent. The example of the Jamaican conch has been alluded to already, and the question of the Surinamese coastal fishery. But the actual extent is actually unknown. One of the things, though, is that there's a general feeling, as you can see from the slide, that it is significant, it's important, it needs to be dealt with. And it's not as though people are ignoring it, we actually are trying to do something about it. The question, of course, is whose job it is. Who's got the responsibility? And that has a bearing on where we're going with this. You'll find that in a number of our jurisdictions, it is the police that have the responsibility. Police have marine units and they have the responsibility. The Coast Guards, to some extent they're expected to do something, but they feel they're more into guarding the coast. The navies, well, not many of our countries have them. The Coast Guard serves as both. Customs, they're more concerned with, guess what, drugs and people. And the environmental agencies don't see themselves as dealing with IUU fishing, they see themselves as saving the environment. And they don't often make the connection between the two. It means then that there's not much priority accorded to fisheries issues and fisheries MCS by agencies that are not fisheries agencies. And that's the sad thing. It's a low priority for them. And so rather than working together, it's not my job, it's not my job. But, you know, we've been working at it, we've been working generally at the national level and the regional level to developing a range of remedies. What about our laws? Some people will say, well, your laws are no good. Well, actually, most of our laws make provisions for dealing with IUU fishing. Most of the laws in the countries actually make provisions for dealing with IUU fishing. There is some concern that maybe the value of the penalties and the nature of the penalties is not enough of a deterrent. But that's anybody's guess, really. One of the things that has come up, and it's been alluded to here, is the issue of IUU fishing as transnational organized crime. The member states have begun to look at our member states, CRFM, at it as a dangerous and highly organized form of transnational crime. It's not just a regulatory issue. Because it had been previously been treated primarily as a regulatory matter, it has not been really looked at, it's been allowed to flourish. But now that we're starting to look at it as a form of transnational crime, we're making important steps in terms of moving our agenda forward. I refer again to the MCS study in 2013, primarily to give you the conclusions. There are some weaknesses in terms of the audited legal frameworks. There are low penalties for infringements, I've already spoken to that. MCS is not recognized as a part of fisheries governance, and a low level of planning at the national level for MCS. Of course, you have a limited number of fisheries management plans on which to focus your dealing with MCS, and inadequate data on catch effort in terms of IUU. So any regional MCS strategy must include regional coordination, and that's what I hope I can give you an idea of. Again, pointing to other forms of fisheries and fishery-related crime. Some of them have been spoken to already. Very often, you find that fishing vessels are accused of being involved in drug running and people trafficking and other forms of smuggling. Sometimes it's incidental, sometimes they just grab an opportunity to make a little quick bread, you know. There's increasing incidents of theft and violence at sea in the South American coastline. You find that there's been talk about more pirate attacks in the waters there, west of Paramaribo, for example. The impacts on the small-scale fishing sector, that has been alluded to already. One of the things that happens, if somebody's already doing IUU fishing, the big boat and all these things happening, for the small man, it means that his grounds are now not as accessible as they used to be. And that, therefore, is one of the impacts that I think Philip kind of hinted at in a way. The money laundering, UNODC has found increasing criminals are using fishing vessels for money laundering. In fact, I don't want to tell you this story in public, but I know in the country I come from, there is a family that is known for allegedly drug smuggling, and then what they did is they started to invest in fishing vessels. And then, of course, well, where do you make that money from? Oh, my fishing boat. You know, so you have that more and more. So it's not just using fishing vessels for the drug smuggling, but using fishing as a cover for whatever other means they have of income. That has been shown. Of course, Noah, David Pohl of Noah shared this slide with me in how we can address IUU fishing. And it's fairly simple. We have to look at it in terms of the vessel level as a resource management issue, look at it along the supply chain, and look at it in terms of the market. I'm not going to go into the details and read everything on the slide, but the general picture is that this four-pronged approach, if we add to that the proper levels of enforcement and capacity building, we can go a long way in dealing with it. So what are we doing? Well, I'll take you quickly through some of what our countries are doing. In Barbados, we find the police marine unit and the defense force handle IUU cases. In Grenada, the Fisheries Division and the Coast Guard have joint operations spearheaded by, usually when a foreign fishing vessel report comes up. In St. Lucia, there's an ongoing, though informal, collaboration between the Coast Guard and the Fisheries Department. And the question of informality is important here. Very often what we have been doing doesn't get on the record as being done because it's informal. We don't often have these formal memoranda of understanding or letters of agreement. So you say, oh, well, nothing's happening, these people aren't talking, but they're doing it. I can give you stories going back in my early days in fisheries where cooperating with the police who are the ones responsible for Coast Guard in my country. And you don't see records of it. You don't see records of it because it's not documented. But it is happening. Very often I think it's not. In Guyana, Guyana actually is now developing a plan of action on IUU fishing. They've had public consultations on it. And there's been regional collaboration within the CARICOM community. In addition to that, there have been a number of platforms for MDA, Maritime Domain Awareness platforms, that are being used by the countries, notwithstanding what some reports may say. The Bahamas has been fairly active. They expanded their fleet by acquiring 9 vessels. They work with the U.S. Coast Guard to some extent, and they have a plan aimed at improving the detection and monitoring of vessels at sea. In terms of Jamaica, well, Jamaica, actually their fisheries laws are quite good because it means that when they get a vessel, the perishable goods can be sold and the proceeds go back into fisheries management and development, which is a very useful thing. For example, in 2019, 10 foreign vessels were caught fishing in Jamaican waters and something like $800,000 in fines. Excuse me. They've also been able to forfeit the vessels, and in some countries, after they forfeit them, they destroy them, and not quite in Jamaica. They have some challenges with getting that around the courts. Trinidad and Tobago, well, they've been looking more at monitoring, control, and surveillance, carried out primarily by the Fisheries Division, and that's the problem. Remember, I showed the slide, whose job is it? Well, notwithstanding the Fisheries Division may not have the assets, but they are the ones tasked in the main. And they're looking to developing SOPs, standard operating procedures, that can be utilized with themselves and the Coast Guard to deal with it. Suriname, well, they estimate that they need that additional fishing effort to do IUU fishing about 30% of the authorized amount. They're looking at intensifying inspection and compliance measures and a number of things. For example, the obligations of license holders. If you hold more than one license, then all your vessels must go in for inspection. So it gets on the record. These types of administrative things that countries are trying to do. In terms of the non-CRFM countries, a quick look at them. And French Guyana, well, is France, French law. So they have the rights to know what the French can do. And that means that they tend to be fairly strict. They have had seizures of 67 tons of fish and 281 kilos of swim bladder. There was a number of their French legal instruments in terms of dealing with the problem. In Nicaragua, fishing activities take place in the waters of the EZ, but they must be carried out by natural or legal persons. So it means then that anybody who's not a Nicaraguan, you're illegal. And that, in fact, makes it a bit more challenging for the illegals to do their work, because they have to get like this proof of nationality. And that's what they've been trying to do. All captures of the industrial vessels that land must be inspected. That also helps in terms of dealing with it. And all industrial fishing vessels must use VMS. So that's another thing that they've been doing. Panama, they've been looking mainly at catch certification schemes, development and implementation of fishery sustainable certification, and their parties to the PSMA, FAO Agreement on Port State Measures. NOAA has what they call the Counter IUU Fishing Toolbox, which looks at many levels. They have the legislative levels, they have their own, what they call regional fisheries management organizations. They're parties to the Port States Agreement. They have trade monitoring programs. In terms of our CARICOM region, and I think I only have about 8 minutes left, so I'll try and speed up here. We, as a region, the CRFM, we signed on in 2010 to the Castries Declaration on IUU Fishing, which actually a commitment to work together. So we have that commitment. In fact, some of our countries, as way back as 1990, had another declaration on common fisheries surveillance zones. The OECS countries had a Castries declaration then on common fisheries surveillance zones where they agreed to share their assets in terms of surveillance, monitoring, and control. 8 of our member states are members of the acceded to the PSMA. Well, we like to say 10 because 2 of our member countries are overseas territories of the UK, and therefore they fall under the UK's thing for that. We all participate in the WCAF, Western Central Atlantic Fisheries Commission, and the Regional Working Group on IUU Fishing. In fact, the CRFM Secretariat is the convener of that Regional Working Group, and they've endorsed a Regional Plan of Action on IUU Fishing. Recently, 12 of our member states signed the Copenhagen Declaration on Transnational Organized Crime in the fishing industry, and therefore the Blue Justice Initiative. We've had technical meetings to look at the issues and prioritize. CARICOM Impact. Impact is the implementing agency on crime and security for the Caribbean community, for CARICOM. And it utilizes maritime domain awareness tools and provides reports to the countries daily in terms of vessels. The algorithms in these MDAs assume that certain types of movements suggest fishing, and therefore that alerts the impacts, and they pass it on to the countries. Hey, these vessels out there, and it's linked to the other international identifiers. Though sometimes vessels go dark, but the fact that it goes dark is itself indicative and is also utilized. That is also shared with us at the CRFM Secretariat on a monthly basis, but definitely daily they send reports to the countries. We've been talking about training. I was having a conversation before we started on fisheries prosecution and interdiction. 58 persons to date between 2017 and 2019. In fact, one of my challenges personally is I'm the chief facilitator for that training program. I should have been leaving Belize today to go to do the 3-week course. What we did is we broke it into 2, 1 week online and 3 weeks in person, including at sea, where we bring fisheries officers, police officers, Coast Guard officers together and look at issues related to how to carry out an activity out there that will take it successfully through the courts. And we have somewhere between 14 and 20 that will be joining us on Monday to have the second part of what is the 4th course. Some of our countries already have national plans of action on IUU fishing, and we have guided the development of a number of measures at the national level. 5 more of our countries are currently utilizing a template that the CRFM Secretariat, I have to say CRFM Secretariat, developed for the national plans of action. And in fact, I already mentioned the fact that Guyana has had some national consultations on that. The other countries are working on it. St. Lucia is looking at the second draft, and Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and somebody else looking at the first draft. We started to look at IUU fishing not just as IUU fishing, but as a wildlife crime. There's a tendency to divorce them, but environment and wildlife and fisheries. But we've started to look at it also as a wildlife crime. And so we were part of the initiators, a partner in the formation of the Caribbean Wildlife Enforcement Network, which we call Caribbean. We've been working with UNODC, participated in some of their activities. We brought them together at the first in-person edition of the Caribbean Forum on Maritime Crime, where we actually had sessions on IUU fishing. Again, letting people know, because one of the problems we have is that sometimes the military don't realize that this is a problem. And the police don't realize the problem. And ignorance really is what causes them not to react. Since we have the training of the RSS, the 58 people that I've mentioned, they have noticed an increased number of reports of fisheries interdiction activities taking place within the member countries. So it's really important to note that it is people knowing what's going on and aware of the issue that actually helps make things happen. We've been working with our countries to encourage them to do a number of other things. They're there. I'm not going to go through them. If this is streaming online, I think our online people can see the slides as well. Interestingly enough, I don't know if you're aware of an activity called Operation Trade Winds. If you throw your mind back to the shipwrighter agreement that the US had with countries in the Caribbean, they started a series of activities, security activities called Operation Trade Winds. I think it's about 30-something years now. But for the first time in the 30-something years, IUU fishing was a topic. And they actually had activities in Operation Trade Winds looking at IUU fishing as a maritime security thing at that bigger level. So we are doing things, and I really want to emphasize that. I must say though, I have referred to the RPOA IUU. One of the challenges we have is people's readiness to implement them. FAO recently did a study and showed that there are three main needs in terms of implementing these plans of action. One is the budgetary and financial assistance that's needed, and as a result, training. Two is capacity development, and three is getting the information, research and statistics on which to base it. I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. So in conclusion, I really want to say that our states are working towards the development and implementation of a range of remedial measures to improve monitoring, control, and surveillance mechanisms, including the development of legislation and regulations to govern fishing in the high seas. We've been a lot of us have been involved as fisheries officers, not just environmental people, in the BB&J discussion that was going on in New York recently. IGC 5 was going to be continued sometime soon. The lessons we have learned can serve as guidance to chart the way we think, and the collaboration between ourselves as CRM, the CARICOM Secretariat, impacts the RSS, and within the wider framework of the Western Central Atlantic Fisheries Commission. There's a need though for enhanced cooperation, and that's where my whole story is coming to this. We get reports, we get stories where they go and they say, this is not happening, that's not happening. The insight studies that have been spoken about, the 9 countries, I have read through the ones that deal with my member countries. And I'm not saying that they don't tell a story, but it tends to suggest that people are not doing anything. And that's the problem. When you get these people go out there and I'm sorry guys, let's be honest. We all have our biases. We all have the things we want to see. We all have the stories we want to tell. And we have to be very careful when we do that, that we get all the information and recognize what is happening. You may, very often these studies say, this is not happening. You're naughty. You're not doing this, you're not doing that. The fact is we're doing it within our limitations. And we have limitations. I mean, you know, when you can, I don't want to be making excuses, but let's get the reality on the ground. Yeah? And it's important that we recognize that to support the work that we are trying to do, there is a critical need for technical assistance. We have limitations. When studies, what you guys are doing, CLALS and Inside Crime, now you maybe need to flip the script. You need to take a study and look at, okay, what's the good that's happening? And how can we bring that good that comes out against the backdrop of the things that the current studies have shown? And when you've done that, then you get the big picture. And that's what we need to start to talk about. And I think, having said that, I should stop here.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your presentation and your overview on the scope of the problem in the Caribbean and some countries of Central America. I think it's very important that you highlight that the fisheries sector does not give this problem the priority that it deserves, and they were not investing enough in monitoring, control, yes, sorry. The non-fisheries sector, yeah. The monitoring, control, and surveillance. And which is why it's so great to know what the CRFM is doing and these remedial measures that you're working on. It was very interesting to see all the things that you're doing in the different countries of the region. So it was great to know about that. I'm sure that we will all like to know more about this toolbox that you were mentioning. So it was, yeah, I think it's great that you give us like an overview about this. And of course, this last message that you gave us, considering what you're doing with the limitations and the reality on the ground is also very important. So thank you very much for your presentation. Let's turn now to Jorge and your presentation on Central America.
Thank you, and thanks a lot for the organizers to let me be here. I will concentrate on the IUU that happens on the Pacific side of Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia. That's where we work. And when I say we, it's Marviva Foundation. Marviva Foundation is an NGO that has 20 years of working in this area. The first 10 years we spent trying to face IUU in marine protected areas. So we had even a fleet of about 14 vessels working in different MPAs in Panama and in Costa Rica. And after 10 years, we moved into the coastline, and now we have 10 years of working with the coastal communities, mostly with fisher organizations. I'm gonna, you cannot have it. Okay, no problem. I'm gonna do it without that. The issue of IUU is a very serious issue in our region. According with official records, around 80% of fish catch is IUU in our region. Okay, so, and that's official. Probably it's gonna be more than 80%. One of the big issues is that we have a really weak enforcement. Even though we have multiple agreements and efforts, like forestry measures, like training, capacity building, the situation is still very weak. And in terms of legal compliance, even though we have a very weak enforcement, 33% of the legal complaints are related with the use of illegal fishing gears. Okay, so this is a very worrisome problem in our region. The lack of enforcement allows for the fisher communities to use a series of illegal fishing gears like the porcine, the artisanal porcine, for example, which is one that is being extensively used in the Pacific, and it produces large amounts of catch and bycatch. The use of small mesh in the nets is also probably the largest problem that we have, but also the use of explosives and artisanal trolling. There is also temporal and spatial closures that are not respected, that usually even in temporal closures where the fishers receive subsidies from the government not to fish big fish. And the lack of enforcement allowed them to do so. This is worrisome not only because of the state of the natural resources related with that, but the problem with price dumping. The illegal activity, especially, for example, porcine methods, allowed the capture of large amounts of fish, and therefore the price is dumped. And they sell it at half, a third of the value that the rest of the fishers will do. And that produces a severe economical problem for the majority of the fishers, because I have to say that there is a large component of fishers that try to do things right. The other big issue is related with fisheries management. Most of the agencies in our region are really weak. I mean, they don't have the human resources, they don't have the financial resources to the tasks that they have to deal with. There is corruption in some of them, you know, that has been ventilated in courts and everything. But one of the big issues is that they are not working with information. They don't know exactly how many fishers there are, for example. So if you look at Costa Rica, for example, they talk about 14,000 fishers in one publication. In another publication, they talk about 6,000 fishers. And that gives you an idea of the ambivalence of the data. And also worrisome that there is no commercial control. So if you go to the market, you will see illegal products being sold there. In a recent analysis that was done in Costa Rica, 70% of the commercial establishments were mislabeling the products. So they are selling something that is not what they say they are selling, or it doesn't come from where it's supposed to go, or the name is not the appropriate one. There is no license control. About 70% of the fishers do not have a license. Okay, and that means that thousands of fishers are out there without a license, and that is of course very difficult to manage a fishery when you don't know how many people is fishing it, and on top of that, the landing data is very partial. There is no capacity to record the landing of fish. For example, in Costa Rica again, there is 5 authorized landing ports, but landing occurs in about 200 landing sites. There are 12 inspectors for the 2 coasts, the Caribbean and the Pacific, for 24 hours, 7 days per week. Of course, if you do the math, there's no way those guys are gonna be there. So there is a lot of landing that is not in the statistics. So you don't know how many people is fishing, you don't know what is being fished. And that is a considerable challenge for the agencies. The other big issue is the capture of endangered species. A lot of the species that are being captured are endangered. So there is a tragedy there in which the countries sign international agreements like CMS, like the Migratory Species Convention or the CITES Convention, saying that yes, this species is endangered, but the Fisheries Agency considered that a species of fisheries interest, and therefore authorized the capture of that species. And so we have, for example, sharks, which is a group that is of high concern in our region, being caught during the last 5 years. For example, in Costa Rica alone, we capture about 7,000, almost 8,000 metric tons of shark. That was exported mainly to Mexico with a revenue of $11 million FOB. And at the same time, we exported around 455 metric tons of shark fins, mainly to Hong Kong. And that provides an income of about $25 million. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the size of the business and the problem that it represents. In the same line, Panama, for example, exported around 19,500 metric tons of shark meat to the U.S. And about, which was, $33 million. And about 654 metric tons of fins, and which represent about $6.5 million to Taiwan. Why our countries are doing that is something that, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. But the most important problem here is that this activity, together with other ones, I don't want to say that IUU is the only one, but certainly a very important one, has produced a significant reduction in landings during the last decades. So Costa Rica, for example, lands half of the fish product that used to land 20 years ago. Okay, and Panama lands about 45% of the product that it used to land. Colombia, for example, is very troublesome. Reductions have been of about 55% in the Pacific, but in the Caribbean has been up to 90% reduction. And so that it represents a socioeconomic problem, of course. That means that thousands of people are not getting the product and not getting incomes. And ironically, that happens in the context of our countries consuming more and more fish products. Okay, so Costa Rica, for example, used to consume about 1 kilo per capita per year in the 30s. Now we are consuming 8 kilos per capita per year. Remember that countries like Spain or France consume about 14 kilos per capita per year. Okay, so if we are going in that trend, that means that we have a long way to go still. And as I say ironically, what we are facing now is an importation of product. So 2/3 of the fish that is consumed in our countries is imported from Vietnam, from China, from Africa. And at the same time, what we cut, or what we catch, 64% is exported to US or to Europe. Okay, so we have this complicated issue of importing a lot and exporting. Of course, there is a differential price there, and that's the reason. But that's one of the big challenges that we are facing. And of course, why we are doing that? I think that there is a lot of limitations in the agencies and the fisheries agencies at this moment. I mean, they are facing a challenge that is beyond their capacities. Okay, of course there is corruption in the agencies, but there is a lot of poverty really in terms of resources, human and financial and technical resources. For example, inspectors, fishery inspectors are underpaid. You know, almost anybody will earn more per month than a fishery inspector in our country, and that is an open field for corruption, of course. And there is no tenure track for them, so they can be removed anytime. There is no coordination among the agencies, and that is a real problem for us, because agencies like for example, INCOPESC in Costa Rica, which is the fisheries agency, doesn't have police authority. That means that they can see a crime, but they cannot interfere. They have to call the Coast Guard, and they depend on the Coast Guard to actually do the capture. And also, there is no regional coordination. And countries like us that are small, the fish resources usually move from Ecuador to Costa Rica, or from Panama to Costa Rica, not knowing that they cross an international boundary. They don't care. And we don't have any exchange of information regionally. So that's also a big problem. We see this in the context of the lack of marine governance. We have grown in a very sectorial approach. So our countries have agencies that look at the fish but don't look at the environment. Other agencies that look at the environment but don't look at the fish. Other areas that look at marine transportation and they don't care about what they are doing with the environment. And you know, that type of sectorial approach development is typical, and we are lacking any body that actually coordinate the effort of these agencies. In the agencies themselves, there is no capacity for control and surveillance. So even though we have new technologies like satellite tracking, like BMS, they don't implement it. You know, for example, in Costa Rica, the law says since 2005, it says that all vessels, all fishing vessels, should have BMS. Less than 4% of our fleet has a BMS, and they're fishing. Okay, so this is something that is giving us a headache, really. At the same time, there is no market limitations. So we commercialize illegal gear, for example. You can go to a store and look at illegal gear, because the law doesn't prohibit the commercialization, importation, or exportation of illegal gear. They prohibit the use of it, but not the commercialization of it. And that's a big problem. At the same time, I already mentioned there is a lot of issues related with the labeling of products, with the selling of illegal species in the markets. And there is no, that depends totally in other department, in this case, the Ministry of Economy and Commerce. And so they need to have inspectors that will look at what is being sold and what type of product they are selling. Okay, so what we have here is really a decaying sector. I mean, this is a sector that is dying. And it's dying because at this moment is the sector that has the highest poverty levels in our countries. So if you look at Costa Rica, for example, where you look at the levels of 30% of the population being under the poverty line, that is in the coast. Okay, and it's the same with Colombia, or it's the same with Panama. Okay, I am not saying that it's all over, but certainly poverty, united with the lack of fish in the sea, is fertile ground for narco traffic, and that is one of the big illegal activities that are now related with narco traffic in the fishing communities. Okay, so we have a minor part, certainly of the fishing sector doing narco traffic, but even though they are a small part, their impact is very large. Is because it's an impact on the resource, it's an impact on the price, and it's an impact on the security of the communities. So related with that illegal fishing activity, there is money laundering, and there is transportation of fuel to supply the fleets or the vessels that carry narco traffic on the high sea. Okay, so and the irony of that is that that fuel is subsidized by the governments. Okay, so for example, Costa Rica is subsidizing in the order of $2 million per year of fuel to the artisanal fleet, and part of that fuel is going up to the narco traffic vessels. There is a growing conflict between those few guys that are related with narco traffic activity and the vast majority of the fisher community that are not doing that. And you see that every day in our countries. You see people being beaten, killed, property destroyed by the narco traffic activity, and this is growing. And at this moment, I can talk later on about that, but we have different initiatives that has been related with this growing concern. So at this moment, we are at the brink of really serious ecological and socioeconomic crisis in our coasts. There is poverty growing, resources going down, and illegal activities at the same time exploding. The agencies don't have the capacity to counter that type of problem. Because again, we don't have marine governance, and we need, as a solution to that, to start by implementing marine governance in our seas. The era of this conception that the ocean was part of our boundaries, was not part of us, it was a boundary. And even our kids in the primary school 10 years ago used to say that the Costa Rica, Panama limit to the west with the Pacific Ocean. No, doesn't limit to the part of the Pacific Ocean is part of the territory. But that conception was not there 10 years ago. So now we are, until now the governments used to leave the ocean to the fishers, and now they say, well, this is something that maybe we should be looking at. So governance mechanisms is one solution that we urgently need. Production alternatives is the other one. It's true that the resources is going down, and at the same time, it is true that we need to provide alternatives to the fishers. And so there is areas in which we need to invest more, like coastal tourism, like aquaculture, which is probably a sector that will see a lot of growth in the upcoming decades. But we need to overhaul the fisheries agencies. We need to establish quota systems. For example, Costa Rica doesn't even have a quota system. Colombia has a quota system that we know that doesn't have any scientific foundation for that. I mean, there is no inventories of the fish. There is no information about the landings or how many fishers are catching. So it's a quota system in paper. We need the agencies to be able to cope and deal with new technologies. Okay, there is a lot of new technologies that will facilitate the control and surveillance required in this area, and remembering that the fish is a public resource. I mean, it belongs to everybody, not only to the fisher, and we need to manage that so that another sectors can also prosper, like tourism, for example. But to do that, we need data. We need the agencies to start knowing how many fishers there are, what is being caught, really. And we need to start developing market solutions also. We have to invest in international trading mechanisms. If 60% of the fish that is caught from our region is illegal, how come, I mean 80%, but 64% is exported to the US, how comes that the US buys what is an illegal product? Okay, so it's very important to start putting pressure on these international trade mechanisms to reduce the use of illegal mechanisms in the capture of fish. For example, Panama. Panama has been during the last 2 or 3 years on a yellow list for the European Union. The mission that came a couple of months ago to Panama concluded that it still is in yellow, and it's going to be in the yellow. And there is a lot to be done before they can get themselves out of the yellow list. Okay, so I think that these international trade mechanisms are probably a big solution also to put pressure on the countries so that they will pay attention to the management of their fisheries. And I guess I will stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Jorge. This was a very interesting presentation, also concerning to know all the challenges that the region is facing when fighting IUU fishing. Also, I think it's very interesting to highlight the corruption that you mentioned, the fishery sector, the low salaries that make them more corruptible, this lack of long-term planning when facing this problem. It's concerning, and I think it's something that we see in all this presentation, that this is a problem and we're facing a lot of challenges because agencies maybe are not capable enough to face this problem that has such important impacts on the economy, socioeconomic as well. I thought it was also very interesting what you mentioned about the fishing gears and the fact that they prohibit to use them, but as you mentioned, you can still commercialize it. So this is a lack of coordination in the law as well. I think one of the important things that we can highlight from this panel that we saw in Philippe's, in Peter and Jorge's presentation is that this is a sector that is very vulnerable to other crime, a major crime, as drug trafficking. This was a common aspect that you three mentioned. And also I think that we saw a lot of opportunities for intervention as well in your presentations. Of course, there is a gap in information that especially Jorge mentioned, so maybe we can see how technology can help close that gap. Again, I would like to bring up the toolbox that Peter mentioned and all the strategies that Philippe mentioned. So just to sum up, and we can move forward to the question segment, I would like to remind you that if you're in the room, you can raise your hand, and also you can write down the questions in the chat in Facebook if you're joining us online. I would like to start with one question for the three of you about the actors. I know that you mentioned a lot of the scope of IUU fishing and your perspectives, but I would like you to mention more about the actors promoting IUU fishing, especially the Chinese. I know it's more common to find the role of the Chinese fleets in South America, and I know that we will hear a lot on the next panel about this. But yeah, I would like to know more about the Chinese role in this region, if you can give us some light about that. Maybe Philippe, you can start with the question.
Yes.
Don't forget about the mic, please.
Yeah. Okay, yes, I can start. Well, first of all, I think it's important not to do any China bashing, that is systematic, etc. I think it's very counterproductive, especially with the Chinese government. We're just finishing a paper reviewing some of the excellent work that Miko did, for example, among a few others, and it's important to be nuanced, but also factual, and to really push agendas where the governance efforts by different layers of the Chinese government will actually make a difference, rather than play a very political game of you accuse us of this, but we do that, and it remains a lot on paper in some way. Again, I'll refer a little bit to Ecuador, because that's where I was recently, and with limited knowledge, but So obviously, the Chinese distant water fishing is an issue because it's massive. It's massive, and they've been focusing, at least in the case of Ecuador, Peru, and Inca and Miko will be talking about that, on a fishery that is very poorly regulated, and as a result, it is legal, but we're a little bit in the unknown, and also it's really skirting the illegal. And so I think there is really a need to have more frank conversations and actual concrete measures there that make a difference. And I'm not enough of an expert to see if within the Chinese government, within the authorities, there are some people who are really pushing to make improvements, but are in conflict with others. I'm thinking in particular of regional authorities in the province, provincial authorities, that have very close ties with a number of very large companies that have, financial power, and so that's maybe where it happens. It's like saying, well, who should really take charge within the Chinese government? If the central government is that strong on addressing IUU, can it actually move on to provincial authorities and make the number of reforms that we need to see? Because many things are there on paper and some things have been implementing, there's more disclosure, etc., but it's not quite there. That's for the first part on the Chinese side. On the other part, look at the Ecuadorian government. China is kind of its bunker. We don't know very well what is happening in terms of negotiations. When the door is closed in the ministerial office and the ambassador is there, I mean the Chinese ambassador to Ecuador is there, what actually is being kind of negotiated? What is being done? We don't know, maybe it's difficult to ever know about this, but in my sense, and many people have said it, there's need to be more coordination among countries in the region so that they approach this as a bloc and that China understands that it needs to really get its act together because it's creating a situation that is not good for itself, for the countries, for feelings that many people around the world have towards China. And we need to disengage from this kind of animosity and polarization that we're seeing very generally in this current period. And for that, we need to have a little bit more equal relations, which is difficult to have with China. Sorry, I'm blah, 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 blah. But anyway, so that's my few thoughts.
Go ahead.
Yeah, is it on?
I don't think so.
There's a switch.
There is a switch here.
There you go.
Yeah, I have to turn it off. I hate feedback. I'm always very careful about bashing anybody. I do not know that Chinese are involved in IUU fishing in the countries that I work with. Many years ago, we used to be told that vessels that appear to be Taiwanese vessels were in the waters. Note, I've used qualifiers. Appear to be, we were told. I don't think that we know. I've already said that we're not sure of the extent. But there is a geopolitical thing that's been going on where we are being encouraged to bash certain countries. Let's be honest, guys. I don't know whether it's because it's true or because certain countries feel that this particular entity is affecting their economy, through whose fault I don't know. And therefore, let's blame them, let's blame them. My father always said to me that when you point one finger, there are three fingers pointing back. So we have to be cautious with that. So, having said that, I cannot say that I know of Chinese interventions and involvement in IUU fishing. I just want to throw in a caution. Let's be careful when we bash it.
Thank you. Jorge, would you like to comment?
Yes, I just would like to say that yes, one of the big problems is that we don't have data. And if we don't have data for the local fleet, could you imagine what kind of absence of data we have in the case of the Chinese fleet? We have only hearsays, and we have only very anecdotic information. I think that's something that we have to be careful. One issue that we have to distinguish though is the difference between what the Chinese do at the fishing level through their fleets and what they do at the commercial level through their purchasing. We have, for example, a significant activity in the purchase of bladders from sea bass, for example, that is used in China, I don't know why, or something, as a medicinal, and they use it in cosmetics and things like that. And sea bass is being captured at our coast, and the fisher usually receives $3 to $4 per kilo. But if they provide the bladder to the Chinese commerce, it will receive between $50 to $80 per kilo. So that's of course a big motivation to fish a lot of sea bass, and then dump the sea bass because they don't care about the meat, they care about the bladder. And of course they sell it, but they sell it instead of selling at $2, $3, or $4 per kilo, they sell it at $1 per kilo. And therefore they are dumping the price on this species and affecting the rest of the national fleet. So that's an issue that is happening. We know it's happening. We know who's buying and everything, but we of course don't have all the data for that. We know that in the other aspect, the fishing fleet, we know that shark capture is very, very important outside the EZ. Okay, so it's usually, if you look at the Global Fishing Watch photos, I mean, the fleet is gonna be there right at 200 nautical miles in international waters, but fishing very intensively, a lot of them, hundreds of vessels there.
Yeah.
But we don't have data. So that's all I can say, really.
Matt, go ahead.
Should I talk into
You
him
got a
or?
microphone.
I think so, yeah.
You can do that. No, 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 too much again.
Thank you all very much. We also have some questions from online, but I'm going to throw in just a couple things that occurred to me with each of the presentations, and I'll go in the order of the presentation. So, Philippe, I was wondering, you kind of showed that there are contradictory effects of these narco crimes, and you're not sure which is dominant, it sounds like. I just wanted to see if if I understood correctly.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
I think, the scope of our study was very limited in a way, through the public material. Most of those articles are between 200 and 500 words, sometimes even like just 50 words. And so the information that we can get from that is very, very limited. Then there are reports, and there's much more material there, and they tend to have two types of storylines. One is the poor fisherman, the house got destroyed by the flood, he went out to get some money, got arrested, now there's a de facto widow with 3 kids. And the other one is these nasty guys were out to make a buck and live the life of the gangster, and they should be incarcerated. But there is a little bit of no nuance and no analysis of what does that do for the fishing sector, etc. From what I could observe, and again, this is like a few days of visit, it looks like, just north of Manta, where, that port where you've got more trafficking, looks very prosperous. There's a lot of boat out there. So I would say, the mayor is supposed to be implicated. There's a lot of money around and a lot of boats, which means probably a lot of people with boats that are capable to go very far for fishing also. And so my sense is this is an overcapacity case, for example. But I don't have the data for that. It's just an impression. So it's really a call that I'm making, where this would be very important to do. There are many, many important things to do. As I think maybe the US and others are embarking into this, anti-IUU, to realize what are going to be the different impacts, etc. And politically, what are they going to be? Including, if we stay extremely political, what kind of support we're going to see along the coast. Will they want to see a more pro-US, or on the contrary, quite leftist, And my sense is, if you hammer these guys hard, they're going to go left very strongly, as they did, in South Korea. There needs to be a lot of reflection around that. Sorry. And regarding the data, I cannot but say the data is there. Chinese companies have very detailed data on how much fuel they use, how much squeeze they get, who they're employing, etc. And so the transparency. I worked for a very long time on the extractive sector and was part of the team that helped set up the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, etc. And that's the same thing. When we started, we worked on Angola, and even the parliamentarians had no idea how much money was coming out. It was kind of, secret. And then, slowly the consensus changes. So why can't we have, if any vessels is in the high seas, and to get to the high seas already you need a certain capacity, you automatically have to report to an international agency, So a global RFMO, if you want, not regional, but a GFMO, okay? And that is a simple step. And given the technologies that we have, all these guys have satellite, etc. So I understand there are commercial. In the extractive sector, we went through all these things. It's commercial contracts, it's confidential information with commercial interest, etc. but that's really something that can be pushed. You know, ideally we would get a ban on high sea fishing, but we could have this first step, and having all the information would be very, very, very useful. So VMS, IS automatic, and monthly reporting. Anyway, it's just a thought.
Thank you. Thank you. Peter, I just wanted to say thank you to you. You're always very good at pushing back on, let me call it the dominant narrative, and I appreciate your pointing to all the good work that's being done. I did want to go, I wish we could put up a slide. I won't do it now for time's sake, but you had a great slide with the 4 prongs of the approach. And you talked about the supply chain and the market and laws, and I don't remember the 4th prong, but vessels.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder, as we're thinking about the limitations, you were very careful to say, you know, we're making progress, but we are facing limitations. Where are, I mean, I know that they run the gamut across those 4 prongs, but where should we focus our attention as we think about them?
That pause is significant. I don't know. I don't think that we can focus any one place. I hate to use, some people don't like to use the example, but I don't know if you know the concept of blitzkrieg. In the Second World War, the German army was known for using what's called a blitzkrieg, a lightning strike. Lightning does not strike the same place. So they use striking at different places as the charge built up. And I think when we're dealing with this, that's what we've got to do. We've got to take a blitzkrieg approach. We're going to take an approach where we address all of them. Focusing on any one of those 4 prongs is not in and of itself sufficient. For example, fishing effort we found is driven to a large extent by consumer demand. At least in the small artisanal fisheries of the Eastern Caribbean. So consumer preference is a driver of fishing effort. That being the case, then you have to consider the market. Yeah? At the same time, your legislation that allows you to escape with certain things needs to be changed so that it doesn't allow you to deal with these things. So you've got to look at that. In so doing, it means you look at your vessels and what your vessels can do, and the types of vessels you have, and the restrictions you put on the vessels themselves, yeah? And consequent upon that, if you address it, you've got to address it in different parts along the supply chain. Whether you use things like traceability methods or so, in order to watch what's happening along the supply chain. See where I'm coming from? So there's no one place you can focus. The nature of the problem, in my view, is such that you have got to look at it from different perspectives. And that is where the challenge comes for small developing states with small vulnerable economies. They don't have the wherewithal to do that. I remember having an argument with I don't want to call him a friend. We almost fell out because of that. His initials are DP, and he looks at a university called DPC, and he may be an emeritus at this point in time, where we were having a discussion, and we were at a meeting in Portugal. And I was talking about the work that we try to do in the region. And he said, well, maybe what should happen is these small countries that have no money should forget about trying to manage their fisheries, close their fisheries, and import all their fish. That seemed like an easy way out, but the fact is, what about our livelihoods? I mean, we have not spoken since then. I ask about him every now and then, but I have not contacted him because I'm really pissed off. It's a stupid attitude of a brilliant man. But the thing is that we've got to take a look at all of these different perspectives. The thing about finger pointing and bashing is a problem we have. If we as a community, a global community, approach this thing properly, working together rather than pointing fingers, we can probably get there, you know. But we're too busy with the geopolitics, you know. Yeah, that particular country and this particular country. And so I feel very strongly about it. So let me shut up because I might end up saying something that's not politics to say.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm taking over the question and answer period, but just one more question. Jorge, because you mentioned the term money laundering, I'm asking you an unfair question because I don't think that was the purpose of your talk, but one of the questions we had on Facebook Live was about the extent of money laundering in IUU fishing, and I wonder if you would be willing to comment on that. But I also have a question of my own, and that's about CMAR and the marine protected area that's been created that incorporates some of the countries that you focus on. And I just wonder how you reflect on the capacity enhancements that come with that, if there are any that come with that. So.
Okay, I would like to start by saying that CMAR was not recently created. It was created in 2004. It was relaunched by the presidents, and the media kind of start talking about creation that was not created. I mean, it has been there for 18 years or so. It has been there without little success, I have to say. There is severe limitations in the capacity of the agencies to look at the hundreds of thousands of square kilometers that have been created as MPAs. And there is a lot of interest by the donor community now. We are talking about probably $300 million during the next 5-10 years as donations for that region. But I am concerned about the capacity of the governments to even handle that amount of money, and the capacity that they will have on implementing effective actions. One of the big issues is that is going to be on top of especially protected area systems that, with the exception of Galapagos maybe, the rest of the countries don't have that capacity. With no negotiation with the fisheries sector, and so there is they are starting in a very conflictive step at this moment, and no against no governance. Okay, no governance structures that will allow for actually implementing that system. So I am very reserved, as you can see, and in my projection of how this will actually be implemented. I think that probably a stepwise approach in which we gradually grow in the next decade or so, it will be better than dumping $300 million on that area with the present infrastructure, institutional and legal infrastructure. I think it's very limited. Okay, and in terms of money laundering, I have to say that we again only have what we hear at the communities, and is basically phantom companies that are created for fishing activities. The new 20 vessels with big motors that are bought and given to a single guy in a community. Those boats moving fuel into the high seas, and that of course give us ideas that money laundering is there, but again, only speculations.
Yes. Can you pass the mic?
Hi, Judy Gerhard, Accountability Research Center here at AU. Thank you for the presentations. I have two questions really, I think sort of for Peter and Jorge, but please. Liz, I do a lot of research with fishers in Southeast Asia, and one of the things that's come up from Indonesian fishers, for example, is this disconnect between the different agencies that Peter and Jorge both mentioned, the silos that exist between the agencies that should be supporting the industry or enforcing. And one of their concerns is that because the international agencies are not coordinated, so you have the IMO, the ILO, the FAO, and they're still working in silos. To what extent do you think that those international agencies coming together in a more cohesive way would help create a more cohesive approach at the country level? That's their recommendation. I'm curious to see how it would translate in your world. And then the other one is, I think it's been alluded to, but nobody's really talked about fisher organizations, the sort of agency of the fisher communities themselves, and how that's being encouraged or supported or enabled to help address some of these solutions. They're sort of being pulled into illegal activity from what you're saying, but there probably are people in those communities who would be supporting them. And I think Philippe mentioned that more work needs to be done, but who's doing that?
Okay. I'm really glad you brought up the question of the agency of the fishers communities. From the perspective of our member states, we have encouraged the formation of a Caribbean network of fisherfolk organizations. That network is represented at all our technical meetings that feed into ministerial decision making. And they have been very supportive. For example, in the issue of IUU fishing and TNOC, they have been very supportive of the thing there. In fact, they've actually developed a code of conduct for fishing as fisherfolk that will drive and allow them to see themselves working in the perspective, in the type of direction that we think are good. So from where I sit, the fisherfolk engagement is an important thing, and for the countries that I deal with, we are seeing it more and more, and they are taking charge in a sense of the direction. In terms of your first question on the impact of the global inadequacies on national activity, it's an interesting question. Let's talk about imperatives. When a certain unnamed country, but a university I know of is named after, decided to reduce its contributions to the United Nations, it had an impact on how the United Nations agencies could work. It meant that they found themselves now having to compete for limited amounts of funds. Without limited amount of funds now coming into the mother agency. What that meant, of course, is that we have to hold on to our kingdoms. And you found that we got more of I would not get such a word, siloization of activities, primarily as a consequence of needing to utilize limited funds. Now, the question is whether that redounds to at the national level. I'm not sure. I think that there's a willingness on the part of the national level agencies that correspond to these international agencies. So for example, the maritime administrations which deal with the IMO, because they are driven to some extent, or they're encouraged by the IMO directions, then they see a certain way of dealing. If IMO is not talking to, for example, the FAO, then they may not see themselves talking down at the fisheries level when you come back to the national. I don't think it's deliberate, and I don't think they even realize they're doing it. But there is an impact by virtue of the fact that the driver at the international level impacts the operations and may impact the operations at the national level. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my quick response to what you say. But it comes back to something I said earlier. The need for that global picture, the need to look at things globally and not to be saying it's yours or it's mine, but it's ours. If there's one thing I would love to see in the next 10 years that by law of averages I have of life, is that, no, it's actually 6 by law of averages. I would love to see us taking a more global approach to the management of all of our resources. And we talk it, we say it, but we don't really do it. And maybe the question that you've asked is one that should make us perk up and start to think a bit more about it. And I've spoken enough on that thing. Okay, Jorge, because I have a question for Jorge.
Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I will go for the first question, and I think that it will be very nice to have it, very difficult to have it, but certainly the development of a global vision, and I agree a lot with Peter on that, and this creation of our ocean instead of my part of the ocean is very important, and it will probably help the local implementation, which is what is really all this about. I think that still there is a lot of challenge in that first world level coordination. but it will help a lot if we could come to that. I think that that will be very positive. And in the second one, I forgot what was it. The communities. Yes, I think that in our countries at least is clear that community is actually pushing the agencies now, and confronting the agencies, demanding more action from the agencies. And I think that for example, we have been creating committees and platforms and whatever the name is in each country, and now they are facing the authorities in meetings or in the media or even in the street sometimes, and demanding changes, and changes are happening because of that. So I think that empowerment of the communities is very important. This vision of a central agency in the capital giving instructions to the local communities is gone. It's part of the past.
Yeah, definitely. So I kind of second that. I think the associations also have an important role to play because they have a reach and a trust within the communities, and so they can also convey some messages and help. Some, I don't like the word discipline a little bit, but sometimes you see, in the communities a lot of inequalities. We talked about people using different gear and some making more money because of nice stuff. So there's often a lot of tensions there, and having, associations that are at a little higher level than just the community can help leverage the interest of the most vulnerable people within those communities also. I don't know if my point is a little bit clear. It's clear, but I think that's quite important. The second thing I would nuance also, I think national and regional authorities also have an important role to play in preventing these, silos from, like whichever agency wants to do this or that, etc., and really know where they want to be going and working with them. And also not to forget, the philanthropic sector is very important in that domain, and often is driving actually where UN agency may be going, because the seed money, etc., will be coming from OSENA and others, etc. So that's an important one as well. And to nuance maybe a little bit, we've seen it with the FAO and UNODC. It's quite clear that the two are dealing with blue crimes, but one is on the fisheries crime, and the other one makes sure with UNODC that they're not talking about fisheries crime, because it's the FAO's mandate, and they don't want to overstay. At the same time, they're doing a lot of stuff together, and I think that's really helpful. So it's a really quite positive example where two agencies, different mandates, but having this global impact and reflecting, especially because the FAO is supposedly driven by the small-scale fishes guidelines and has a kind of pro-livelihood agenda that maybe help to counterbalance the UNODC that may have more of a police crushing aspect. Thank you.
If I may take hot pursuit on Philippe, the work of UNODC and vis-a-vis the work of FAO, we're starting to see it coming together now. In fact, when you listen to the discussions at COFI 35, which today is the last day, one of the things that came out when they were talking about the discussion on the question of IUU fishing was the recognition that more and more you see this type of collaboration. And so I think it augurs well. A lot of the work we have been doing on IUU fishing has been because of the recognition of IUU fishing as TNOC, Transnational Organized Crime. And so I've brought UNODC into the fold of looking at fisheries. The question of IUU fishing as a wildlife crime, and therefore the creation of a Caribou Wen. And these are the types of things where, yes, you have the directions, but we're starting to see and it augurs well. The issue of the philanthropic organizations, now that's another weak discussion. I'll give you an experience very recent in the talk on the agreement on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. A lot of regional and sub-regional entities whose negotiators are primarily negotiators and know little about biodiversity, they have been helped to get people together to talk by some of these bingos, big international NGOs. But because these bingos have their own perspective, they have given information to these negotiators who are hearing about that for the first time. It's not their thing. Now we all know the first time you learn about something, that's what stays in your head. So you have these negotiators who are now talking the story of the international NGO and not really having discussions with their own people who have the other perspective. And when they get the other perspective, they still are being driven by what they first heard. So I think that's another complexity to the issue. I'm not trying to knock anybody. I'm just saying that when we talk about these influences at the higher level, it's very important to bring in the role of these philanthropic organizations, these bingos, in terms of driving the perspectives that we have. I just want to add that. Thanks.
Pierre, you had a final question for Jorge, right?
Yeah.
Would you like to do that?
I hope this is not seen as the Peter Murray show. I had a comment on something Jorge said. He was talking about the question of alternative livelihoods, which is essentially what it was. I remember some years ago I went to a meeting in a country just immediately south of the US that borders on the country where I live, among others, but we remain unnamed. And they were talking about, in one of the provinces, a concern had come up by the women, that the men are going out and doing this very dangerous thing. You know, fishing is considered one of the two most dangerous professions in the world. And so they spoke and they got support, and all the support went into this sort of tourism-oriented coastal tourism, and encouraging these fishers to go into that. And after about a year and a half of that, the women were happy. The men were safe, they weren't going out to sea, and money was coming in, even though it wasn't as much, but they were happy and they had their men safe and all of that. But by the time we had gone there to talk to them, the men were getting frustrated. Because there's something about people who go to sea, you know. There's something about the sea that's in your blood. I can't explain it. If you talk to a maritime lawyer, he thinks differently to a land lawyer and a maritime surveyor. You know, people that are in the sea, they have a way of, whether the sea gives it to them or they go to the sea because of it. And so what you found happening is that you suddenly found the men were no longer going along this thing. They were frustrated, and they were getting so frustrated that they no longer took an interest in what they were doing. So the attempt at alternative livelihoods, while in theory sounds good, has got to be mindful of what a colleague of mine calls the psychosocial aspects. The thinking here and here, head and heart, that makes people go into a particular thing. And all the theory of what's good and what's not good means nothing if you don't get into the heads and the souls of the people. So I just want to point to that you talk about alternative livelihoods, and I'm not sure that they are necessarily sustainable, because after a while, the people who, I mean, come on, you've been going to sea for 40 years, 30 years, and suddenly they're saying to go and plant seagrass. I mean, it sounds interesting, but the psyche of a farmer is different from the psyche of a hunter, and fishermen are hunters. So these are the things we have to think about when we're talking about the drivers that make us guide our management. That's what I'll add. Thanks.
Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I have heard that argument many times before, and I think that part of that is true, but only a part. Okay, I think that, for example, we did an evaluation last year on 100 and something fisher communities in the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. 85% of them say that they will rather have their children doing something else than fishing. Okay, and I think that yes, alternative livelihoods for me is probably the way to go, because just the simple fact that our resources are decaying, our consumption is increasing, the number of people is increasing, makes fishing a dead end. I mean, at least at the levels that that we should have. There is no way that the fishing resources in our oceans will sustain the future demand. So for me, aquaculture, for example, should be one solution. And the hunters gave up and started agriculture 10,000 years ago. And I think that we should be doing the same in the sea. Fishers should go into aquaculture and mariculture. Not all of them. I'm not saying to finish fishing. I think that the fishers will be there forever. But I think that we have to limit the amount of fishing in our oceans depending on the capacity of the resources to provide.
I think the important consideration, not to take away from anything you're saying, the important consideration, the point I was trying to make, is we need to be mindful of these nuances. And we need to understand that there's no one size fits all. What works in one part of a country may not work in another part of a country. And it's that mindfulness that I'm calling for. When we're making decisions that impact on the livelihoods of people, when we're making management decisions, we have to think of these nuances, not just what the theory says and what seems to make good sense. Because I can give you another anecdote, but I won't. What makes good sense is not always workable in a particular place or particular time. And just say, let's be mindful of that when we're going down these directions of decision making.
Okay, we ran out of time 15 minutes ago. I would like to thank Philippe, Peter, and Jorge again for sharing with us your insights on IUU in the region. It was a very vibrant discussion that we all enjoy and learn a lot.
I've just been observing and thinking about some of the cross-cutting themes, and I think one of the ways that we can address those is by first reminding you and inviting you to read the report that we produced on this topic, the AU Center for Latin American Latino Studies, together with Inside Crime, which provides, I think, a broad-based landscape of the more specific and targeted discussions that we heard today. And I just wanted to remind you about some of the conclusions of that report, sort of building on some of the things that have been coming out of this conversation. Looking at adverse consequences of IUU fishing, the scope of crimes associated with IUU fishing, the legislative frameworks and treaty obligations, and then capacity for interdiction law enforcement in all of its different modes, physical capacity, surveillance capability, etc., including prosecutorial, judicial capacity. We arrived at some basic conclusions, and these are the need to build regulatory, legislative, law enforcement capacity. This should come as no surprise to anyone who's been here today. The need to build whole of government networks. I'm going to circle back to that just briefly in a second. The need to establish more effective controls over transshipment. I think that's been a theme. This came up in the shark discussion. Assess and control of ports. We were just talking about Montevideo. Increased beneficial ownership and flag state transparency. The theme of transparency has been a recurrent one, I think, related to a variety of other issues that are systemic across this topic. Ensure that fishers bear the true economic costs of fishing rather than being able to launder. Target high offenders. We were just touching on that theme in the question that you just asked, Matt. And then expand and safeguard protected zones. It seems to me that sort of at 100,000 feet, one of the reasons why IUU fishing is a kind of classic example of a wicked problem is because it combines a variety of things that move against the way we've set up the systems that we try to employ to address it. One is the tremendously scalar nature of this problem. We've been talking about the international level of treaty obligations, regional, domestic, and local level, artisanal fishing fleets, and the ways in which IUU fishing has purposefully or inadvertently exploited gaps and loopholes in the lack of integration of these levels of scalar engagement, the international, the local, and everything in between. And the very patchwork nature of the state of affairs that we are currently inheriting as we begin to kind of ramp up attention to this problem. And that shouldn't surprise us because, as Joshua was talking about, you know, IUU fishing is part and parcel of an integrated global economy and supply chain. And so it's a problem at scale, and those kinds of problems always prove to be particularly bedeviling. It's also a problem of bounding, and it's a classic transboundary problem. So one of the ways that's come up repeatedly is in the different designations of, you know, exclusive economic zones, protected marine areas, you know, littoral areas, national waters, international waters, and the fact that we tend to think of the ocean as a kind of uniform something, but in fact it's a highly partible set of different kinds of ways in which the rules apply and the game is played depending upon where you are, and that's clearly a problem. But also it's impossible to connect this problem, to address this problem without acknowledging and attempting to connect it to other equally wicked problems. So one such problem is, you know, the drug trade and, you know, other associated crimes. And the ways in which that affects what we're doing when we try to approach IUU fishing are severalfold. One good example is the fact that it's very difficult to address IUU fishing problems comprehensively when you set systems up to deal with drug problems. So there's one issue. But another issue is, you know, something that was kind of, I guess, you know, kind of playing behind much of what we were saying, which is climate change. Climate change is a large problem that is responsible for rapidly transforming local, national, regional economies, and is, you know, incentivizing, among other things, agricultural collapse. And particularly, I forget who talked about this, maybe Jorge. There was a clear sense in which one of the clear important dynamics here is the labor force IUU fisheries is in large part owed to the fact that people are having to change their livelihoods, and that moving into IUU fishing, particularly at the artisanal level, is becoming a problem, and it's going to accelerate as agricultural economies continue to decline or be put under stress. The other question is, who counts as a perpetrator in this universe? And this is a very familiar conversation to me, because I should just say briefly, you know, my background is in the Andes, and I lived and worked in Bolivia for many years, and had a front seat in the, you know, very unfortunate long-term war on drugs effort in that country. And one of the recurrent themes there was a critical inability to understand the predicaments of coca growers as petty capitalists who were not really the criminal masterminds of the global coca trade. And there's a similar note being hit, transversal note in the IUU fishing field, which is to say we have lots of artisanal fishers who are engaged in activities through necessity, more often than not, as a question of livelihood. And I think Philippe set the right tone in that part of our discussion right off the bat, indicating we should be careful about who and how we decide to criminalize, you know, as we go about the work of engaging this wicked problem at a systemic level. Because clearly going after people whose only options are fishing is probably not a productive approach. And then finally, and this was something that I think need not be pointed out, but I'll do it anyway. You know, we're clearly at the beginning of, you know, a more comprehensive attention to a problem that many of you in this room have worked on for many years. And one of the notes that I think, unsurprisingly, therefore, gets repeatedly sounded is, we need data. And there's this interesting relationship between lack of data and lack of transparency. And I think that, you know, we can see that there is, in this arena, a particularly challenging particular set of challenges around creating better baseline data to be able to have more accurate estimates of the state of the world's fisheries. And this reminds me as well of similar types of situations and other work we've done at our center around wildlife trafficking. and where we again work closely with Insight Crime. And I remember having a data discussion where we were trying to talk about how difficult it is to estimate, the amount of trafficked wildlife in different countries, and the only way you could do it was by border seizure data, which of course is totally random, and at best just gives you a sense of a trend that is much larger, but you have no sense of the volume or scale in any of this. And here, there seems to be a particular role for technology, both in making it hard to gather those data and in efforts to improve the data landscape, whether it's managing, whether it's the flags of convenience issue, or the turning off the transponders, whether we're getting better at different kinds of digital surveillance or not. This seems like, more than in most other cases, a technological problem to solve. With that, I'll stop. I found it all very interesting. I really appreciate everybody who made it here for the conversation, and I just want to thank everybody for staying with us throughout the day. Thank you very much.